Welcome to the Books and Beer Book Club, coming to you from Cercis Brewing Company in Columbus, Wisconsin. We're a different kind of book club, only reading books by authors who can visit us in person or via Zoom for the discussion. We've been going strong since 2015, meeting nearly every month. We're now making these fun and informative discussions available to you on video. I'm your host, Valerie Beal. I'm an author myself, and I enjoy interviewing our guest authors and facilitating the questions from our readers both in person and on Zoom. We hope you enjoy this replay. To join us live, please check out our schedule on our Facebook page at Books and Beer Columbus.
Welcome. And a local author,
Yes.
which is exciting. I'm glad we were able to make it. So Laura works a full-time gig as a physician's assistant. So she had a full day today already.
I did.
Yeah, which
I
is,
did.
so this is
And tomorrow.
and tomorrow and tomorrow. So
And the day after that.
this is very typically authors have a day job. They're not full-time authors. And so we'll talk a little about that and juggling and stuff, but welcome so much.
Thank you.
I always ask people to start off things because I don't know you really well. We talked a little bit at the Art and Author Fair back in the fall, but tell us about, how you came to write this book. Did you always like to write? Fill us in. Give us the details.
So I've always loved to write. When I was in high school, I was like editor of the high school newspaper and all that sort of stuff. Always loved writing, but I always loved medicine. And those don't really jive. So, so through college, going into college, I was going to be doing the PA route. And it was a very rigorous schooling with very few electives to be able to be had. So I only got to choose, I think, 4 electives out of my entire college curriculum. And I spent 2 of them doing English. So one I did in drama and one I did in fiction. My fiction course that I took, and my professor said to me after class, he goes, "Hey, just wait a second." And I said, "Oh boy." And he goes, "Do you think that you really love medicine? Because I think you could write. I think you could do English as your career." And I'm like, "No, medicine's my thing. Medicine's where I'm at. That's my lane. That's what I'm going to do." And goes, "All right, but I think that you could do this." And so the prologue for this book was an assignment for his class.
Oh, wow.
And
that's cool.
Yes.
Okay.
And so I had wrote that as part of his class, and I had sort of played with probably, and I'd have to look for sure, but maybe the first 3 to 4 chapters of the book. I'm like, "Oh, I could turn this into something." And I did that for the rest of that semester. So I was a sophomore in college when I started it. And then I started PA school. And so I never touched it again.
Yeah.
And so my daughter was in 3K. So she just turned 6 a couple weeks ago. So 3 years ago, I had this nudge to say, "Write the book." And I'm like, "What book?" And then I'm like, "Wait." And so I resurrected this from my dead college laptop and pulled it out. And
I'm so glad you were able to do that.
I called my mom. I'm like, "How do I retract a file? How do I get this from the hard drive?" Because mom used to do some IT stuff.
Oh, that's very helpful. That's very helpful.
She goes, "You need a cable." So I was able to retrieve it, pulled it out. I'm like, "Yeah, this is it. This is what I'm going to go with." But with now the notion of all of my 12 years of ER and trauma and dealing with suicide and teen depression and adult depression on a weekly basis, and just hearing these cries for help, and a lot of these teenagers, their families not knowing that they even suffered with it until the day they were in the ER.
Right.
And so
they were lucky they got to the ER.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yep.
And so it was like there was such a need for resources like this and in fiction, and be able to have that. And so then I resurrected it. And it's interesting because you can probably even tell, especially you reading it, the style change, because the first 4 or 5 chapters of the book were written as a sophomore in college, compared to the rest of the book being written with more of the adult style and perspective And then in the editing phases, it was like, all right, I got to really try to merge these better and try to make it kind of all one voice. But that's kind of where that came from. And then I reached back out to my college professor.
Oh, did you?
I did.
Nice. That's
And so
nice.
once it got published and was done, I'm like, I don't know if you remember, but, and I told him like how he had said that and sent him like a face of the book because he's not at Marquette anymore.
Yeah.
So I had to kind of track him down, and he goes, I remember that class and I'm so glad you picked this back up. And just, it was really a cool connection to make again.
That's very fun.
So,
Well, and the thing is, yeah, when you're doing the education part of, life, you can't really have the two tracks. Those are very separate tracks.
very,
It's not like an adjacent science thing,
No.
where you're kind of even on the same part of the campus. You're like, very different buildings. But, now like you can do both. I mean,
Yep.
it's hard, I'm sure. And, like try to find the time. You've got kids who are busy with sports and just, generally busy with school. You're doing all the mom stuff, doing the work stuff. So you've got that like push pull with time. But it's sort of like you can do it.
I can. And
Apparently you can. 'Cause you did do
apparently I
it.
can because I did. But I mean, certainly it's hard to find the time, but like, so the book got published about a year ago now.
Yeah, we're
So
almost at the 1 year
so
book birthday.
April 7th is when it got officially launched and released. So we're about a year old into it, but I absolutely loved the writing process. It was my own version of like reprieve and therapy of like my own like me time. And if I would start to feel restless and anxious and like, oh, I'm just angry at the world, I knew I needed to write. And so it was like I needed to write. And then once I would write, I would feel better. And so it was my own little kind of passion project and loved it, every piece of it. And so
Well, that's you're a writer. You're a writer.
Yeah.
So my family says that I'm a much nicer person if I've had my writing time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a thing.
It's a thing.
And it's all right. And
It's a
all right.
healthy thing.
It is. Well, I mean, especially when it works.
Right.
And if they give you a little time and then you're a little nicer or whatever.
Yeah.
So you touched a little bit on your inspiration for this story, seeing so many things through the healthcare
Mhm.
perspective. And I'm trying to think, okay, so you finished this. So you were writing the majority of this during the pandemic or some of
Yeah, most of it,
Yeah.
really. I mean,
Yeah.
so I picked it up before the pandemic started. So I picked it
Mhm.
up in November of
like
2019.
Yeah. So just before.
Just before it started. Took it along with me. I did a medical mission in Bangladesh
Oh, interesting.
in
Yeah.
December of 19 into January of 2020.
Mhm.
Took it along and worked on it there with me too, and was like, yep, I definitely want to pour into this. And then worked on it through, and that was where like my coping strategy, because COVID in the ER is terrible for
Yeah.
for that first year.
So you
of
were
it.
doing emergency medicine at that point?
Yes.
Oh, wow. During
So-
COVID.
so
Ooh.
I just stopped emergency medicine in September,
Okay,
and now I do family practice.
gotcha.
So
Wow. And it was where were you doing the emergency medicine?
Beaver Dam
Okay, yeah,
Yep.
so nearby,
nearby.
but still,
Some traveled to Milwaukee
yeah, but
just
still,
to cover, but
wow. Yeah, no, we know the ERs were not well, they're never actually easy places. And they're not,
yeah.
the nature of who shows up for you.
Yeah.
But yeah, during the pandemic, it was not good. So.
Yeah.
Well, and I think, so what I found really interesting too, I mean, we talk now a lot about like kind of in retrospect, as we're looking at, kids and the isolation they were then having. And really, there's a lot of self-isolation that goes on with the internet and with, social media, which you completely touch
Yep.
on and, work through. But it's, there's a lot of problems with the kids that are the high school age kids. They missed out for one on a lot of
They
stuff.
did.
But even when you take away COVID, the heads down, social media, this and everything like that, that's their world. And I saw something this weekend and I cannot remember who posted it. I feel like it was another author. They were trying to get their teens to go do something. And then they wrote a thing, like a little, mini essay about the stuff they used to do in high school. Like, well, we go to youth group. And then we go do this, they had their church friends and then they have their sports friends from, high school or whatever. And they were out and about doing stuff. And they're like, I tried to get my kids to invite friends over to do stuff, and everybody's like, I think we're just gonna play video games and like talk on the phone while we play video games. And it was like, and it was sad. And it was a sad little essay, but it was like the truth about, so what was funny is I think I read that like probably like Monday, and I had read your book over the weekend. So like, like when you read something and then you see like examples of something everywhere. Yeah. It was kind of bad.
Yeah.
So, but so your kids, you don't have high schoolers yet.
Not yet.
I mean, you will, but like
I will.
You have 12, like
He
middle
turns
school.
12 on Monday.
Okay.
He turns 12 on Monday, and then my daughter just turned 6 a couple weeks ago.
So when you were seeing the kids coming in, you're seeing teens coming in, having tried to commit suicide, and you've got, can't even imagine beyond rattled parents.
So the youngest person that I have seen try to commit suicide was 8 years old.
Oh my God.
8.
Oh, wow.
And I came home and my son was 8 at the time.
And that just had to be like,
and I crawled in his bed and he's waking up and I'm like trying to just hug him and he goes, I'm like, you
like,
just need
stop it. It's like, what's wrong with you?
much. And now that he's gotten older, like, and I don't have those as many moments now in family practice as I did in the ER, but even last year, like I would sometimes come home, and whether it be like the suicide or some of the alcohol and drug abuse or just a little pediatric death or something like that, I would just come home and hug my babies.
Yep.
And he got really good at just knowing like, mom needs you. It's okay. But so, I mean, 8 is so frightening to think about, like, where do they even get the concept of killing themselves?
Right. And where
it's like, what have they been exposed to?
Right.
How do they even know how?
Right.
How do they even think that this is an option? And just, so there's so much of that, like what they've been exposed to from a young age that they think is normal. You know, they don't think that it's a problem. They think that it's a normal part of life. This is how you cope. And it's been demonstrated to them.
Right.
And that is just so scary. And then you do have lots of, as they age and the teenagers and things like that, of lots of times it was the ER of when their parents would be crying and desperate. And I didn't even know there was a problem. I didn't see it. How didn't I see it?
Right.
And you would have all walks of life. You would certainly have the kids where, they've had that rough upbringing. They've maybe had some neglect or flat out abuse.
Right.
And then you have the typical average American household.
Right.
And then you have the helicopter parents.
Right.
Where there's just as much problem. It crosses all gamuts. It's not just one specific, category that covers. And there's so much, like you mentioned, of the social media and the filtering of like, this is the picture perfect life and this is what you're expected, and no one can live up to those expectations.
It's all very glossy.
Yes.
It's like a lot of, and so I think, so my kids are in their mid to late 20s. So they were just getting like social media as they were late high school. And they say now, like they're like so grateful that they didn't have to navigate middle school or early high school.
It's terrible.
And we were terrible parents, and our kids didn't get good phones, meaning not the track phones that were just for emergency. Like practice ended early, that phone, because there were no more pay phones. And we were horrible because they didn't get them till they were seniors, with all the extra, bells and whistles on them. And they were so mad at us. They were so mad at us. And, and then you've got the older kid who's like, don't you dare let the younger kid get it sooner than I got it, But everyone's just glued to all of this, and it's all glossy, and there's all the filters. And I absolutely adore the kids that are real, and the ones, or in the adults who are real, who go, like, filter, no filter. And you're like looking and you're like, yeah, you're like, you don't look like this all day long. Like this is, and there's so much, it's so fake. It's just so fake. And everybody builds all this, like these little worlds that aren't real.
Right.
And nobody can live up to that.
No.
And then you don't have anybody to talk to.
Right. You don't actually have real friends.
No. Everybody's just like, well, they didn't like my post.
Yeah.
And there's so much emphasis on what people, like the interaction. Did I get likes? Did I not get likes? Do you guys have any like people, like younger people in your families that like realize like how like freaked out they are when they post something and it doesn't get any attention? It's crazy. I don't know. It's, yeah, they live by it. They just, yeah. So do you think that, I mean, is it mainly the isolation that occurs because of the way we are, that you're seeing it, or is it just so many different things? It's just one of the things.
It's just one of the things.
Okay.
It's just one of the things. And I think that there's depression that's been, I mean, through the test of time. I mean,
Yeah.
For eons and eons. And part of it is the culture change, I would say, also of the work ethic and sense of entitlement is so different than from people that live through the depression and those time periods versus the now where everything is instant and it can be, Amazon can have something to you tomorrow. Yeah. And
well, depending
all
on
of
where
that,
you live,
well,
Amazon might have something to you
they can
today.
deliver it in 2 hours maybe. But
by drone.
But there has been such this switch of entitlement. And I don't, when you look back over the last couple of decades of, well, where did that develop and how did that develop? And I think that's such a piece of that. And this whole like, well, of course I can make $1 million being an influencer. Yeah. And
well, and some people actually are making $1 million.
They are. It's like, I don't even know how that works. Like, but they do it. And so every kid thinks they can do that now. And well, why do I need to work hard and get good grades or have some sort of study of interest or focus? I'm just going to play video games and then be a YouTuber, and so just, it's such a different concept.
That's interesting.
And it's just, it's incredibly different. And that's its own isolation, just like you said, you invite invite your friends over. This is what we're going to do. No, I'll just talk to them. Like,
yeah. And or they just chat with them
as they're playing.
So they're all in the same game,
the fake world. Yeah.
And then they're wear the headsets and then they chat via their game controller. Yeah. I don't know. I don't live in this world. Like my kids, like I skip this because I don't have grandkids yet. And they're like, I don't necessarily get it. It's only when my grandnieces and nephews are around and they're just like this. They're glued to the phone. We will walk in a room and it's like holidays, right? And they're all in a row on their phones and they're not talking. No, or they are talking to each other by chatting, even though they're sitting 2 feet from each other. Right. It's a weird thing.
It's a very weird thing.
I don't think this bodes well for us.
No, it does not at all.
No.
Communication. They would have anxiety just walking into this room right now.
Well, yeah. So we talk about anxiety and anxiety.
They don't know how to social interact.
No. And it's not, and I think I just remember so I had one really, really outgoing kid and one really shy kid. And we used to be like, okay, so you're going to go up to the counter this time and order the, like bottles of water, something simple, right? And the petrified look on her face. And, she grew out of it,
but if you didn't push it,
no, and
it would have been just perpetuated and then she wouldn't be able to function as an adult.
No. And that was a basic thing. She was fine with her friends, but to have to do something like that. But even now, I'll say to my kids, were you able to, make that appointment or did you call about that, whatever we've been talking about? No, the thing, I couldn't do it online. So
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it is. And then you add COVID into it, that was already happening.
Yeah. And then now
you add COVID and now I'm not at all for sure of a statistic, but say a third of the workforce is now working from home.
Yeah.
And now you take this group of adults that are now going to act like teenagers in their own isolated little world of Zoom. And
we've seen
meetings.
It. They get up off the couch and they don't have pants on. They're wearing underwear,
And so now you're taking the ones that used to have good work ethic and used to have really good, and now they're reverting to that and, having all those extra components of working at home from the last 2 to 3 years, and some of them are now transitioning back to the office and they can't function
No,
in that environment anymore.
but the anxiety though too. So the anxiety, so often depression and anxiety are very much paired together.
Yes.
And the anxiousness, like if you have ever had an anxiety, like it's hard to describe, like this feeling of worry and just kind of, it's overwhelming,
Mhm.
like kind of internal,
Mhm.
where your brain's spinning and you
Right.
can't, and you know, kind of, it's not logical, but
You can't get yourself out of it.
right.
Yep.
Yeah. So, do you see, like, if you're seeing patients with those sort of symptoms, like, is it all, I mean, are you often seeing that paired with depression? I mean, is it
Very commonly.
Okay.
So now that I've switched to family practice, it's, a different perspective. When I was in ER, I saw people almost always in crisis, the worst
right.
days of their year,
That's right.
the worst days of their lives, always in crisis. And whether it be mental health or something else that was there, and it's like, whoa, their anxiety is through the roof, like, but they have a logical reason why they're going to have surgery. Or,
Mhm.
it was always an acute process. And now that I've switched to family practice, it's more okay, this is what's going on in my day-to-day life,
Right.
not in crisis mode. And it is very much, we have scoring systems we use,
Okay.
in terms of, they're called PHQ and GADS, and they rate themselves.
Okay.
So it's a 1 to 3, they rate themselves of both depression scales and anxiety scales. And some, I would say 2/3 of the people have kind of a combo of both going on. And some are like straight up anxiety and some are straight up depression.
Mhm.
But that helps you gauge in terms of, okay, how can we help them better then?
Right.
And like ones that are just anxiety, okay, well, is it about something specific or is it every little thing? And is it something that counseling can just help with, or do we need short-term meds or
Right.
different things? And then, so it does kind of help stratify. And it's interesting because the objective, like scoring of those very much just gives that objective data of how they're subjectively feeling.
Right.
And
So it's like a self-reporting.
it's a kind of
Yeah.
self-reporting. And then what's really helpful is like, whether we start counseling alone or we start a medicine or something, we do like a 4-week follow-up and like, okay, now redo your scores and see how you're doing. And then they do that kind of usually ahead of time of their appointment. And I don't lead with that. I like, just how do you overall think you're doing better?
Right.
Or not doing better, and like why, what component is worse?
Mhm.
And then we pull up the objective data of like, well, that actually matches, or no, it doesn't match with how you're feeling. Like, that's why. And it just kind of gauges like, is the therapy working or not?
Mhm.
And then also too, it helps to kind of trigger like, is this normal anxiety, depression, or is this something underlying? Is this a bipolar? Is this a split
Right.
personality? Is this schizophrenia? Is this, and it brings up all those other questions of other diagnoses of, well, they're not doing as well as I think. Well, why not?
Right.
And it kind of opens that door, especially because in our area, we don't have great mental health
We
resources
don't
at all.
It's so hard to
And-
get in especially for kids under
yes.
18s. It's really, really hard here.
And so my clinic has been a little bit of a mental health clinic,
Yeah.
which is perfect. I mean, I'm used to that piece of it in the ER, but like, it just ties right in with like my little passion project here.
Right.
Yeah.
Surprised to see how quickly she took to the counseling.
Yeah.
That surprised me, like, she was like, nobody sees me, I don't want anything to do with this world, and then she like just grasps it and goes with it so easily. Is that, you see that, or is it?
Yes and no. So some, they've been in desperation mode so long, and it's like, finally, I have a solution. And they finally have talked to somebody about it. They felt that way forever. And they finally have talked to somebody and they're willing to like embrace it, do whatever it takes. And then you have ones that, yeah, I've talked about it, but I don't want to do that. And I'm not taking meds and I'm telling no one about my problems.
Yeah.
And, and there's, right. Right.
Right. Because you have to have rapport with a person who's
You
your
do.
counselor, your psychologist. And,
Yep.
you don't always have that with the first person
Mm-mm.
you're assigned
It's
to. And if there's-
trial and error.
and sometimes there's not a lot of options.
Mm-mm.
So you're like, I think, this isn't
Yeah.
great.
And so like book 1 was very much like skim the surface kind of and introduce the topic and start the conversation. And it definitely glazed over a lot of things in terms of that. But it was an entry point. because there was things that I had written, but I took out. It's like, oh, that got too deep too quick. And, you know, for somebody who has never had any experience in the mental health world at all, and this is a brand new thing, they just burst their bubble and is like, holy smokes, I didn't even know kids thought this way. Versus somebody who's maybe had a family member or a close friend who's had a kid struggle, they're like, oh, this didn't even cover half of it. This is just the glaze over. But it was intentional. You know, it was kind of that way. It's that in between and trying to introduce it, but not get too heavy too quick. Keep it that young adult kind of level.
So
Go ahead.
I was gonna say, I mean, you have many purposes for this book, but one of them is to use this as a like jumping off point for teens to be able, because
A
it's
conversation starter.
it's one step removed from talking about yourself.
Right.
And so you can talk about this character.
Right. This book I
And it's-
read seemed to mention, yeah.
Right. And
And-
it saves them from having to acknowledge anything,
Right.
but
And so
helps show them that like there's
There's
other
hope,
people and
and there's resources and it doesn't have to always be a desperate gory end.
right.
So when I first wrote the book, the whole point of it was to just say, yes, I published it. Like I did it.
Right.
And the other point was to hopefully that it saves somebody's life. Like that's the goal, is that they read it and they realize, okay, there is hope, and it saves at least one person's life. Like that was the whole point of writing it. But then I loved writing. And so I'm writing more. So I'm writing the sequel to it, which will pick up with Julia as narrator.
Oh,
because-
we're gonna switch. Okay.
So we don't know anything really about Julia at all.
We don't. All we know is
All
she's
she
an
knows-
artist.
Her,
Yeah.
her friend. She's the friend that knocked on the door and saved her.
Subsequent, parallel.
It's subsequent. So it takes, once they head to college, they're in college. So it picks up pretty much almost immediately after. What's that?
I got this crazy friend.
And so it picks
We don't
up.
use that word, Mary. You don't use that word, crazy. You can't use, I'm sorry.
Special and challenging. It does kind
I
of sound
know,
worse.
it actually does sound a little
It
worse.
does sound a little worse, doesn't it? Yeah,
Right,
right.
it
quirky,
can be,
let's say
and
it's quirky.
actually, it can be a badge of honor,
It
you know,
could, yeah.
I'm the crazy friend,
Yeah.
you know, like, whatever.
So it picks up with Julia is going to be narrator, and we're
Okay.
gonna learn Julia's story. I mean, it's still gonna have a lot of Marissa in it,
Mhm.
and the crossover and the dilemma and whatnot. But it's gonna, we saw little hints of Julia of like, oh, I know more about this than you know, and all those
Yeah.
little tiny
Yeah.
teaser hints.
Mhm.
And when I wrote this, I didn't know I was writing a sequel. I just left.
That often happens.
And I started writing a different book first. And then a lot of people kept asking, well, is there a sequel? There's gotta be a sequel. And then I thought about it and I'm like, well, I could do a sequel. And so I did. So it's
That'd
about,
be fun.
yeah. So it's going to be Julia as narrator,
Mhm.
and it's going to cover bipolar,
Okay.
as her diagnosis. And
The title.
I do. So it is going to be, you're the first ones to
Oh,
hear.
oh,
Oh,
Are you allowed? Are you allowed? Is this part of your plan? Is this
I
too
don't
soon?
I don't know.
Okay, well, it's up to you. You're gonna tell us.
I don't know. I'll tell you.
Okay.
You heard it here first. It will be unyielding yo-yo.
Oh, are you gonna do the whole like thing again?
I am.
So
So
it-
part of it was
Like the cover, if you can see, you know, the way she does the.
So-
Yeah.
unyielding yo-yo. So I wanted another word. I
Mhm.
wanted to kind of tie it together. And yo-yo is bipolar, the up and
Yeah.
down. And I was thinking, I was playing with like a seesaw of the up and down, but I liked the yo-yo better, so I could still use maybe the strings.
Yeah, 'cause there's a spin.
And there's
That does make sense, doesn't it? Yep.
Yes, very much more impulsive.
Yep.
And so book 2 definitely dives deeper, not just that top layer of mental health. Because if they got through the first book, they're interested enough maybe to read the second,
Yes.
and it can dive deeper into
Yes.
it and kind of get into more of the nitty gritty and
And
be a little
bipolar-
darker. And
Bipolar is really, really interesting because people will say like, they don't really want to be on their meds because they,
a whole chapter on that.
because they enjoy the creativity. When
Yes.
they're in a manic episode, then there's
There's the
power in
edge,
it.
the creativity.
Yeah. Until it spins out of control.
Yeah.
And so it's really fast. I think it's fascinating. I mean, I'm sure it's
Mm-hmm.
not fascinating to live it, but it's a very fascinating thing to
Disease
balance,
process. Yeah.
that where you aren't, suppressing all that, creativity.
Mhm.
And I think any diagnosis comes with challenges, but also there's gifts sometimes that come with diagnosis and that aren't, maybe always obvious immediately because we focus on the negative always.
Mhm.
So if there's a way to channel some of those creative energies, and not like decide to repaint your entire house in one night,
Yeah.
which actually one of an acquaintance I know who is bipolar did, and got her kids involved and they were going to repaint all the walls. Yeah, that's repaint, like paint, just paint. I don't like this color. Let's just paint the house tonight. And I don't know how far they got.
Yeah.
But it was a moment where the older kids were like, okay, we need help. And then grandma and grandpa got called and
Yeah.
it was like, we can't calm mom down. We're all with a paintbrush and a paint roller.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, kind of like that. Cause then there's no sleeping either
Yeah.
and stuff. That's fascinating. That'll be fun to read.
Yeah.
That'll be
So
fun to read.
I am about 2/3 of the way done of the manuscript on
Okay.
that. So
So I wanted to talk a little bit. I thought the format of this book, because I noticed things like that, but the format was really interesting. So, because of the nature of the book, we had to be in her head.
Yes.
We're in Marissa's head. She's not talking to anybody about any of this. So how else are you going to tell the story, right? And those sort of like interiority, like the interior books, it's harder to write because you can't show us anything through conversation. I mean, you were able to in bits and pieces, but you have to then maintain sort of a momentum and an energy that, I mean, did you find that, would that come very naturally to you? Like, were you channeling her well? Or
I think I could. There definitely was times where it's like, it was hard sometimes to phrase it in a way that was still a teenage version.
Yes. Yep.
And
did your medical mind come out sometimes?
that it's like, well, this is what's going on in our head. But it's like, how can I make that be in a teenage, how they understand the world? Because they're so self-absorbed as a teenager. And that, like, trying to keep that very self-absorbed kind of mindset through there. And like where, she, like, through the book, like, she thinks so awful of her mom.
Right.
And that her mom doesn't care at all because that's where she was in her mind. And so many teenagers think of like, oh, of course my parents know nothing. And all of that. Sorry, Mom.
No, I think that's very accurate though. As teenagers, that's true. That's
they're
true.
just so self-absorbed in nature. And that's how their brain is. Their brain doesn't develop until they're 25.
Right.
And so they're just stuck in that prefrontal cortex of impulsivity and self-absorption and not thinking things through. And that's why some of these like depression and anxiety is so dangerous, because if they're stuck in that rut and they can't get out and they don't talk to anyone about it, well, then they start acting on stuff.
Right. And they're not thinking through. And it's that one moment. And there are people like who will say later that they're so glad that they didn't go through like the next day was better, or the next hour was better, or somebody rings the doorbell and all of a sudden things change a little bit.
Right.
And you're not
changes.
You're knocked out of that cycle, thinking it through or being stuck. I really, really enjoyed her like, finagling of the social media stuff and like all the rumors that she was hearing. And I was like, oh, boy, she's messing with these people's lives, like dropping a little rumor here, dropping a rumor there. And then she didn't even get credit for it.
I know.
And I thought,
and like that was, which was such, I think the big thing of it at the end there, it's like, she in her head thought she was going to be, this is her moment and she's going to do it. And then when it comes crashing around her, well, then she loses, it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter what I do. So
Nope.
no one sees me anyways.
And then I forget the girl's name, but at some point they pass each other going into the therapist's
Oh,
office.
Annika.
Yeah,
Annika,
yeah. And I was like,
Yeah. The
and-
popular one.
and it's
Yep.
like, oh yeah, maybe
Yep.
popular kids don't have it all, you know,
Yep.
it was all glossy on the surface and
Mhm.
yeah. So I thought that was a very nice touch. So
So you started this when you were in college.
I did.
You did a portion of it, so then what were you thinking at that time? What was your vision?
Didn't have one. I'll be honest. I was going to medicine.
Why didn't you?
Cause I loved that class, you know, and I look back, I still have it. It sounds silly, but I have some of those like pieces that I had to write when for his class, and I was a really good writer. And I pulled it out and I read it and I'm like, medicine has destroyed me. Because I write my charts and they're not even complete sentences, you know, and they're sore throat for 4 days, you know, like they're so clipped and short, and like just my prose and just my word structure is so terrible now compared to how it was when I was in college. I was so good that it so when I had that like notion of like write the book, I pulled that out and I'm like, oh, this is good. And then I read some of my other stuff. I'm like, I can do this again. I'm gonna do this again. I have this somewhere in me. And
Marissa the whole time.
but Marissa was the name the whole time. I did change I actually didn't have her named the whole time. She was the character, but I didn't name her. She was just the character.
Character in front for a long time, but didn't want to.
Yeah. And so she was intentionally not named until halfway through, until she was seen for the first time by Julia, who knocked on her door. She was
I
never
totally missed
named.
that. How did I miss that?
She was never named.
Oh, I totally missed it.
Never.
She didn't
Yep.
get-
She was never named until she was seen by one of her peers.
So there.
So I didn't know her name, but I knew her. But like when I was in college, like I honestly didn't think it would go anywhere. You know, it was a short story that like it was a prologue that I kind of continued to play with.
And that was the kind of class it was,
And-
like short stories. And
It was a fiction. It was short story fiction. So we read
Yeah,
like some of the Nelson Mandela and I forget off the top, but our book was just a short story primer.
Okay, gotcha.
And so we did
Gotcha.
breakfast at Tiffany's and, you know, and all the analysis of all that.
And then you were
so-
asked to write your own pieces.
And then we had a couple
Yeah.
pieces that we had to write our own on.
I think sometimes, I'm always fascinated when something bigger grows from one of those like little assignments. So like you might go to a writing conference or something and, you know, you're just in a session, they give some prompts and you're
Yeah.
like, oh, okay. And you play with it a little bit.
Yeah.
And, there's times like I've gone back to stuff and I'm like, oh, I kind of like these characters. I wonder if I
Yeah.
could do a full length story on them.
Yeah.
Or even more than the page you wrote. Like, could it
Mhm.
be like a full length short story, which is like what, you know, how many thousand words, you know,
Right.
whatever.
Right.
So, that's fun.
But so
Yeah.
it was just this angsty teenager, you know, and then like adding the context of the last 12 years. And I was like, oh yeah, there's a story here and I can do this. So.
You have time to read it all? How you bridge the gap of going to your truncated work?
So Wednesdays are off. I don't have clinic on Wednesdays, but I worked yesterday because I was very behind on my notes and everything.
So you went in to do charting.
I charted from home and I did in basket. All those my chart messages you send your doctor, I get them all and I have to respond to them all.
Okay, so there's a thing where like that you may have to start paying for all the pie chart messages.
There is, because it's advice and it's gonna be like a tele something.
Well,
and
but think about how many hours you spent answering emails.
I do. And so we've been discussing this at clinic and I said to our clinic manager and like our site administrator or whatever, I said, that'd be perfect because then it's billable time and I can have 2 patient slots saved for all of that because right now I have to fit that in between stuff and
Or do it at night or
I
on your
saw
day off.
18 patients today.
Ooh, that's a lot. Of
And
patients
so
in
I don't
a
have
day.
time to respond to my chart messages because I had 18 patients to take care of and coordinate plans for. And so I'm doing my chart messages quickly before coming here and, I'll go in early tomorrow and.
Right,
those
because you
types
don't
of
want to leave
things.
people hanging
Right,
because
and they're
you're a
important
conscientious
questions
provider and, you want to.
But if they're gonna be starting to be billable to insurance, then I can save patient slots, because even sometimes those my chart messages take longer than a patient visit do.
Right, right. Well,
so-
and you have to be careful. You have to be just as careful with those because people
Uh-huh.
are asking for like actual clinical advice,
Oh,
like.
And
Yeah.
decisions, and let's order that ultrasound and all those sorts of things. So reading, I love to read. I have a very large to be read pile that's growing by the day on my dresser.
They always do.
That my mom gives me books and my niece gives me books. And so I read in the bathtub and I read in like before, when I was working in the ER, I would go early to pick up the kids from school on purpose so that I would have to sit in the parking lot.
Oh, the car line. No,
And I
parking
would-
lot.
And I would sit and read for 20 minutes and just slot it in. But
Never thought to do that. That
mhm.
would have been a.
Now I
really
only
good
get
idea.
Wednesdays to do that. But so sometimes.
So I had a question about, I was thinking about, so the mom's little sister committed suicide.
Yes.
So I wondered, did you ever consider, I mean, it doesn't work necessarily with your story, but like, would she have been hyper vigilant?
Right.
And then later she does become hyper vigilant.
She does.
But probably because clearly she didn't think that her daughter had any issues.
Right.
But I always wonder, like, we're shaped by everything, we've
Mm-hmm.
experienced. And that if you ever considered, making the mom hyper vigilant, but it really, it obviously would have been a different story.
It would have been a
completely.
different
Yeah.
story. And I think it was the way I wrote with that one was to kind of show that she never processed that either.
Right.
And so like
right.
it was her own version of depression, of just kind of ignoring and being like, oh yeah, she's okay.
Right.
And I mean, that was through Marissa's standpoint though.
Mhm.
And, there was some points in there that I tried to allude to so that it wasn't such a sudden switch of mom didn't interest at all. And all of a sudden she cares a lot,
Right.
of trying to be like, oh, I wonder what's going on with her. But then like just walking by,
Right.
and just, I'm
But-
going to give her that space. And
Right.
right. What else could I add to me or,
Right. Yeah.
um,
Well, it's,
but-
it's an interesting thought too, that she, is maybe like, if she hasn't processed either, like her reaction or her approach to parenting maybe isn't as mature either as it
Right.
should be, because like in that case, she's just not,
she's not present.
Right.
Not even seeing what's going on.
right. After having suffered a certain kind of trauma
Mhm.
where she's feeling guilty for not seeing this sister's
Right.
distress.
Mhm.
Yeah. But it's also serves as a really good purpose that we don't, like the pointing out, we don't always see it, and you need to be able to forgive yourself if
Right.
you
Mhm.
are in that situation.
Well, and I
Yeah.
think that's why I had taken that point of it too, is because of in the ER, so many parents were like, I had no idea. Like, how could they be living in my house and I had no idea that this was going on for years,
Right.
and
Yep.
they're like, I take them to their basketball games and I'm riding in the car with them and we're doing homework together, and how could I not see it?
Right.
And like being even an involved parent, you're missing it.
Right. Yep.
So
You ask them, is everything okay? And they say, "Well,
I'm fine.
Well, and kids do.
Yeah.
I'm fine.
I'm fine.
But it's complicated because you have to there's work involved as
Mhm.
well,
Oh, very much.
and so, and it's not magical, like, you just take an antidepressant and then like, and then being in the right environments and everything. So, I mean, it's so multifaceted.
Mhm.
But I was also curious, so you kind of weave art in as art therapy.
Mhm.
So did you have any, I was just curious, like, did you have any classes in that or anything? I mean, because you really weren't on that side of
No,
things.
not
but-
at all.
I mean, I've seen, like, there's outlets for people, like sometimes it's music or whatever, like some other creative
Mhm.
endeavor, but art in particular seems to work quite well.
It
it-
is. I mean,
know-
any sort of creative process and outlet is good for the brain. It helps kind of as a cross-sectional in terms of using that other part of your brain to help just kind of mesh, and it can be a way for people to express themselves without having to use words or like identify and, of like how they're feeling. Well, it's like, well, this is my art, and they don't necessarily need, and they might not even be able to explain it. it just
Right.
comes out as what it is. I have no classes in art. I am somewhat creative in general, like I'm crafty, but,
Well, you're very creative in your writing. So.
yeah, but, no, I think just having something to be an outlet and being able to express yourself in some way is so beneficial, in
Well, and then-
terms of everything.
And then in the characters in the book too, I mean, they're getting, they're getting really good feedback from their art. I mean, they're getting, acceptance and accolades.
Right.
And then, like the whole college process then too, to major.
And
in
something
art.
more meaningful,
Yes.
than just that social media piece
Right.
of like that inclusion, which is fake inclusion.
Right. Right.
And that it's actually more meaningful
Mhm.
and can serve a purpose.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So that's fun. So it'll be really fun to see how this all plays out in the second
Yes.
book.
Yeah.
Have you had, so I read the book on ebook, so I didn't
Okay.
really look. Did you have like any sort of trigger warning type stuff? Sometimes people put those in the beginning of the book, like,
I didn't.
I was just curious if you've had anybody say like, or like,
I have had, so I haven't done hardly any marketing at all or anything with this book at all. So a lot of the readers and buyers or whatnot of this book have been friends and family, or, oh, I heard about this book because of so-and-so, and like people at church and whatnot, where I know the families very well, and they'll say, well, do you think that my daughter so-and-so can read it? And I'll say, well, this is kind of some of the things that are in it.
yes, yep,
And just be ready to have those conversations, or be like, there are a few scenes in there that are very adult, and just kind of be okay with it. And it's the maturity level of each kid too,
right,
a little bit.
right,
But at the same time, some of it is, and actually one of the moms has said, and I always have said, well, read it first and then decide.
I do that too with people. Yeah,
Because some of them, are okay with their 10 and 11-year-olds reading it and saying, yes, I want them to know like that this is out there, and whether they maybe not ever experienced, but maybe their friends are.
right,
And that they might be able to recognize, and their house could be the safe haven house for that kid.
right,
And then I've had some moms, or a few dads, but mostly moms, read it and be like, oh, I'm going to wait till my daughter's like 14, 15 to let her read that. And it's like, and I've said, okay, well, I respect that choice. And then in follow-up conversations, I'll be like, well, are you sure? Because then it might be too late.
well, and there's
And-
nothing, I mean, this is a tough topic,
It is.
but you're not overly graphic in any way.
No.
Your language is all very, proper. I mean, you're not like overly, like swearing all over the place in the
Mhm.
book, it's accessible,
Mhm.
and understandable. I don't know. I always feel like we don't give our
Kids enough credit.
yeah, like our middle
Yeah.
schoolers enough credit. I like working with that age group.
Yeah.
They're very smart, and they
Very.
see way more than you think that they see, like sometimes.
Mhm.
And they may not always like talk about it, right? Yeah.
Right.
But so if this was a jumping off point, I think
Mhm.
this could be a good co-read where you
Yes.
maybe read it together. I always like doing that. And we didn't tend to read, super serious stuff. Like we would, and we would just pick something and read 2 chapters together. And then sometimes later I keep going at night. It's like, but I think it's fun when you find a book that is entertaining enough, but it's got some other themes that would be a jumping off point for a conversation.
Well, and that's that
Yeah.
conversation starter
Mhm.
piece. It's like, especially if you are recognizing someone in your family or close friends' families that you're like, oh, I think there's something maybe troublesome going here.
Yeah.
And being like, hey, why don't you read this book? I just picked it up, and and be able to talk about that. And
Well, and there is something too, where a friend sees something where they might tell like their parent, who then can give like the other like parent of that
Mhm.
kid a heads up and be like, yeah, I don't think so-and-so's doing so well right now, but
Yeah.
And I mean, like, so it's always tricky,
Mhm.
parent
It
to
is.
parent relationships, like
It is.
when you're, it's a fellow,
It is
like,
right.
classmate or something. But if there's but I think parents are always appreciative, even if it's just a little like nudge, like, oh, there's something maybe like, how's it going? I heard maybe like school was a little rough the other day.
Yeah.
Or something, and be like, what? I never heard anything about that.
Right. My
Right?
kid doesn't talk to me. What do you do here?
Go ahead, Heather.
So I had started working with an agent. I had queried a couple and then had heard no from another agent that it wasn't a long enough YA book. It was too short. Which it is on the shorter side. And then I had started working with another agent and I just didn't like the vibe. And I'm like, no. And I mean, I know nothing about the publishing world at all.
You know,
And so
you know a lot more than you did in the beginning. I mean, you learn as you
I
go.
learned a heck of a lot for this one. But like, I wanted somebody to just be able to take it over and do the rest of it because I needed to still practice medicine and it was the middle of COVID. And so I had kind of went that way. And so I had worked with one agent, decided no, had let it sit. And I told Val this over dinner. One of my friends said, it's not going to get published just sitting there.
We all need one of those friends who's like, would you just get your butt in gear, friends, you know?
And so I then reached out to the publisher I have, Little Creek Press, which if they had said no, I was going to send it on to some of the bigger publishers and just put it out there. So Little Creek Press took it on. So then I didn't go any further with it. Over dinner, we were kind of talking about what I might do with the second book, in terms of how to approach that once I get to that publishing phase again.
So you didn't self-publish it.
This one I did not self-publish.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
So
this one is
Little Creek is like
Little Creek is a hybrid.
hybrid. Yeah. Yeah.
So they don't do like a traditional contract of any sort. So like I paid for their services, but they still only take on so many books a year to do. So you still have to be like accepted and they still are putting their name on it.
Right.
And things like that, but
We've had other books in here. I'm trying to think. No. You could, in theory, you could self-publish for, if you were capable of creating your own, nobody really can do all these things. But if you were an amazing graphic artist and you could create your own book covers and you were a great editor and could edit all your own stuff and you knew how to format a book, you could technically publish for IndiePub for $0, like through Kindle Direct Publishing and KDP print and stuff. But
yeah.
we don't do that because
and I don't have time for that either.
But a hybrid is an interesting option just because the publishing, the traditional publishing world, whether it's a bit like large presses or small presses, there's less and less books that are being accepted. And so it's a really nice middle ground niche that allows you to have the expertise of a publishing professional.
Like I had they accepted it. I had an editor through them that went through a couple rounds of edits. They did my front covers with input. And so they handled the Library of Congress, number, getting my ISBNs, getting it up on Amazon, getting it submitted to
like Ingram
and like things like that.
They're
in Mineral Point.
Yep.
So like did all the pieces that I didn't even know you needed to do to publish a book.
Next month's book is a Little Creek Press book as well, just by coincidence. I could
how I had went with that one. And it's nice because they don't really keep much royalties from it. So it's kind of a nice option in terms of a traditional contract.
There's quite a few, good options out there, and it's just a matter of what's a good fit and what you want to do, how much control you want and how much work do you want to do. Like maybe you are an artist, a graphic designer, and then you could do your own covers, then you don't need that part of it, So it's, there's the opportunities I think are way broader than they used to be to do this kind of stuff. I mean, like before, say 2010, we were way more limited in what was there. So the last decade and almost a half has really changed things. Good. Do we have more questions?
I do appreciate the perspective of like co-reading this with somebody, because as an adult, I started this book and I'm like, I can read this girl doesn't understand what's going on. Obviously, she doesn't understand. But yeah, just for a teenager to know that you're not. There are other people. Like,
Yeah. And
I finally got into it after we got little beyond.
Yeah.
I still can't believe I didn't notice she didn't get named till page 72.
And one of the moms that I've one of my friends who had read it, and she goes, it was interesting, and she chuckles about it, and her and I'll tease each other about it occasionally. She goes, well, my girls aren't like this, but
Uh-huh.
but she said, but I could see, you know, some of their friends, like I can see tendencies that maybe I need to pay more attention to now. Like I didn't know this was a thing. Like she was
Right.
so close-minded she was in her own little bubble. She didn't know the bad stuff was happening around her.
Well, and that happens too. Like, you know, adults get busy too.
Yeah.
We have, you know, bad situations. You know, we don't like our jobs or the home life is messy. And
Mhm.
I mean, like you miss stuff.
Yeah.
And even when, like you say, is perfect, you can still miss stuff. You think that you've got like a perfectly balanced life and things all are humming along and then bam. Unfortunately. So it's, you know, it's interesting. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to the sequel. Now I'm like thinking through, because I was
You're like, I'm gonna steal your pages from your book.
no, I was thinking, so I kept thinking it's going to be continuing her point of view, but now I have to get my head wrapped around
Yes,
that we're
it's gonna be
switching over to
Julia.
Julia. So
You're gonna have a whole new character to learn.
I'm like intrigued. So we will look forward to that.
2 more questions.
Yeah.
You have a social media presence, and then did you ever write Marissa's like college entry essay?
I never did that. That is an intriguing thought. No, I
Oh,
never did.
I feel like that should be a little
I know,
assignment now.
right? Hmm. Yeah, no, I never wrote her like entry essay, never did. My social media, Instagram is kind of my author. Like I don't have a separate Facebook author page at all. I cross post like
Yeah.
for tonight and like the new bookstore up in Beaver Dam. I'm doing a signing for there at the end of April. Like I'll put that on my regular Facebook page, but on Instagram I do an author for that. Yep. And so like I have pictures of me editing at my basketball tournament that I was at, you know, last weekend. And putting it in.
Doesn't everybody edit their books at the middle school like tournaments?
Not specifically. I mean, I do think there will be a yo-yo on it, and I haven't decided if it's in like a taut, like downward yo-yo, or if it's like a tangled mess yo-yo with like the strings all over it.
Yeah.
I haven't decided. Maybe. Yeah.
Cats can be, yes. Bipolar, I think that's probably
Yeah.
fair.
They're spirit animal, right? So, but I had been toying with the title for a while, and in the last month I've really solidified it to this. So
I think that's good. I like that.
yeah,
that works for me.
kind of a
That works for me.
mouthful, and I'm like, I don't know, but I like it. The more I've thought about it, I really like it.
Well, and I have always I really appreciate like the wittiness of this title
Yes,
with the way you did.
the not
Yeah,
done and not
I
undone.
thought that was just
Because
brilliant.
she's not done yet.
It was brilliant.
So
Do we have more questions? Good. Yeah. So thank you. Thank you for visiting us
Thanks
after
for
your
having
long
me.
work day.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thanks for having me.